Who am I?
Richard Kazimer, media veteran.
Why I got in radio is because I'm good with a knife.
Contributor in Perth, Australia.
Our friend Richard Kazimer in the United States.
How are you guys enjoying the 19th century? Is that working out for you? How can you say, I'm not making fun of you as a race, I'm making fun of you as black performers?
I think as a country, Americans are as patriotic as the most rabid UK football hooligan.
Who am I?
Richard S. Kazimer. Well, it's time to catch up with our friend Richard Kazimer from the United States. Why have we given him the Mission Impossible theme? Well, it's because we like to think in our own nasty little way that we've perhaps sent him on Mission Impossible when it comes to finding out some of the stuff that we like to find out. Hopefully it's not too much of a Mission Impossible, Richard.
It never is, but that also means I'm going to self-destruct at the end of the segment.
No. The message is going to self-destruct. Remember, you don't self-destruct. In fact, the idea is that you stay intact. Otherwise, you can't perform your Mission Impossible.
I will do my best.
That sounds like a plan. Hey, something that's been really big in the United States, and it's something I suppose in some respects we have a little bit of trouble getting our head around here because it just seems a little bit odd. I mean, our complaints about our health system are different, but you've got the Healthcare Summit at the moment, and it's all about trying to make sure that people have adequate coverage. And it really does seem, in some respect from afar, to be a bridge almost too far to actually achieve it.
Put it in the perspective that you folks have. Now, you've got great health care coverage. Our issue over here is that if you don't have adequate health care coverage or any coverage at all, you don't get that surgery, period. And that's a growing problem with people losing their jobs in the state of the economy if they've lost their jobs and their employer had provided health care or they were doing a copay with their employer and they no longer have health care insurance. They no longer are able to get medical treatment. Emergency treatment, yes, but long-term care, if you go in with an emergency situation, the hospitals will not turn you away. As far as any long-term care, recovery, rehabilitation, if you don't have insurance to cover that, you're out of luck. The same thing applies to medication. If you don't have health care that will pay for your medication, you don't get medication. So Obama has proposed a health care bill that has been passed in the House. Another version has been passed in the Senate. Now, here in the United States, we have two chambers of elected officials. We have congresspeople and senators. The Congress represents the House. The senators represent the Senate. A bill is proposed in the Senate where it then gets passed, and then that moves on to the House and the Congress. That gets passed there. Now, what Obama is trying to do is to get a comprehensive health care bill that will cover pretty much everybody here in America, regardless of whether or not you can afford health care. If you have existing health care coverage, that's fine. If you don't have it or want better health care coverage, or if you can't presently afford your health care coverage, then the government will offer a public option for you to either buy into or that will cover you. There's a lot of facets to that bill itself.
Why is that something that seems to be so difficult to get happening? It seems to me to be a logical step to take. What is the true obstacle to that?
There's a fundamental difference between Democrats who feel that government is here to protect everyone, protect and help everyone. The conservative Republicans feel that if you cannot afford health care, then you don't deserve it. I don't want to sound partisan here.
I was going to say, you're sounding very partisan in that comment.
That is how they feel. I've got mine and the heck with everybody else. They are blatant about it. It's almost like a natural selection. They would rather that you go to your neighbors, your friends, and exhaust all of your resources before big government steps in and helps everybody else.
But I mean, this is not something that's been new in your country. I mean, there's been plenty of Democrat administrations over the years, most recently, of course, the Clinton administration. Why haven't past administrations like that done something about it? I mean, this issue over healthcare in the United States is certainly not a new issue.
There's a fear of socialism. Democrats and Republicans don't necessarily like the stigma of us being a socialist country. Now, there's a difference between big S socialist and small s socialism or socialist programs. We've had for generations socialist programs in our Medicaid and Medicare, taxes that go to pay for schools, police, and all of our social services, welfare, unemployment.
I suppose it depends on how people interpret them. I guess it also depends on the extent to which people are commercially interwoven into some of these things. And, of course, the health insurance industry, the pharmaceutical industry, in fact, the whole medical industry in the United States is one very lucrative business. And I guess there's a lot of people running around who want to protect their patch.
You're exactly right. And we had talked about this on an earlier segment about the control that the insurance companies have and as much clout that they wield in Congress and in the House, protecting their business, their industry. And the Republicans represent big business. The Republicans are anti-government and pro-business. The Democrats are pro-government and would like to regulate businesses so that everybody is protected, everyone is equal. So there's that dividing line. Now, what the healthcare summit was about was that Obama finally sat down with 22 members of the House and Senate, both Republicans and Democrats, and said, let's work this out. Let's see what we can do and work out and define our differences and try to work something out, because we are going to pass a comprehensive health care bill. There's no doubt about that. So for 7 hours, these two parties, these 22 people and the president sat there for 7.5 hours and just performed some incredible American political kabuki theater. And that was it. Nothing was accomplished.
I was going to say, that sounds like an absolute exercise in futility, if ever I've heard one. I mean, politicians sitting down talking about the fact that they might actually achieve something. I mean, it doesn't matter where you are in the world. That's always a bridge too far, I think.
What it did for Obama was it accomplished once and for all showing the American public that the Republicans are absolutely unwilling to compromise and to work with his administration, with him personally and with the Democrats, and be bipartisan. The Republicans on the other side...
You're never going to expect politicians to be bipartisan. No politicians are bipartisan. I mean, it's not in their interest to be.
Well, here's the thing, though. It affects the constituents of both parties. So for the...
Well, of course it does, but what it gets down to is it gets down to somebody gauges how much it's liable to affect their core constituency. If their core constituency is liable to give them a kick at the polling booth over it, then I imagine that's the way they're going to go. If they figure that their core constituency is liable to agree with the position that they're currently holding, I guess that's the way they're going to go. That's how I would see it playing out anyway.
The reality is that poll after poll after poll show that the majority of Americans, up to 70% of all Americans polled, want some sort of comprehensive single-pay public option health care coverage. It's not a partisan division between what Republican voters want and what Democratic voters want. Americans want the government to get off their butts and provide them with adequate, comprehensive health care. The Democrats are unwilling for some reason. They are the majority party. They, for some reason, don't know how to handle being in charge. And the Republicans think that the minority rules. And by being obstructionists, that they can get away with doing whatever they want and obstructing everything that Obama wants. And to hell with their voters. So they're at an impasse. I think what's going to happen is that there will be what is called a reconciliation. And that's what has the Republicans in a knot, because they're saying that the president is going to jam this down the Americans' throat. And it's not. He's just using what George Bush had used many, many times before. I think something will pass. It has to.
All right, well, follow this. And I mean, of course, it's the old story, isn't it? I mean, politicians are going to use whatever advantage they've got at the time they've got it. When they don't have it, they're going to complain about it. When they do have it, they're going to use it. It's called the nature of politics. And I think that's something else that's also pretty well unique in anywhere else. So something else that's in focus, which I would venture to say that the average person doesn't understand, nor probably do they really care that much about. And whether they should or shouldn't, I suppose, is also another question. And that is the national deficit and the budget that has been proposed by the federal government.
Depending on what figures you look at, the federal budget/deficit is either $1.3 trillion or $12 trillion. There's a big discrepancy there. See, what happens is that each president, when they come into office, they have a proposal of how much money they're going to spend and what they're going to spend it on. We have 4-year terms for our presidents. And generally, when a president comes in, their proposal is always a year or two more than their existing term, with the hope that they will have a second term so they can then fulfill their promise, or else, if they don't have a second term, that carryover, whether it's good, they're going to get credit for it. Whether it fails, increases the deficit, well, that's the next president's fault.
And if it's not his fault, it's his problem.
Exactly, and that gets back to the $12 trillion that Obama has been saddled with. $10 trillion of that was George W. Bush's.
Well, which figure's right, the $1.3 trillion or the $12 trillion or somewhere in between?
The $1.3 trillion is what Obama is proposing his spending.
Oh, okay, so all you're talking about is adding to what's already there.
That's exactly right.
Yeah,
now,
okay.
bear in mind, too, that when George W. Bush came into office after Bill Clinton, George W. Bush had an $800 billion surplus. So he took $800 billion in the bank and ran up a $10 trillion deficit in 8 years' time. And that is not even including the money that went into the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, because that money for those wars was off the books. So if you add up that much money, we're in a whole heap of trouble. There's always this straw man argument that either party will use in trying to not approve budgets. They'll always say, well, what we're doing is we're increasing the debt and we're passing this debt on to our children and our grandchildren. Baloney. Nobody cares, especially if you're 65 years old and you're wondering where your next meal is coming from and you need an operation. You need it now. We need jobs bills now. We need infrastructure now. That whole straw man argument is that, well, somebody's going to pay for it down the line and it's going to be our children and grandchildren. You try to tell that to a husband and wife.
Well, I mean, there's been a fair amount of money spent because obviously you've had stimulus packages and the what have you.
And those have worked for the most part. The stimulus packages or the Job Recovery Acts have worked. California alone, 150,000 jobs. It's not unusual for any state to be adding to their jobs. 2 million jobs is the current figure of how much the economic stimulus has provided. That money goes towards many things, teachers, police, officers, fire, that normally wouldn't have been there, so these people were not laid off. The other thing is it needs to go into our rapidly crumbling infrastructure system here in the United States. We're a very old country, and a lot of the bridges and highways out there have not been maintained for many, many years.
Well, there's a lot of questions that now surround that very issue. Actually, I saw a documentary only last week about that. It's called The Crumbling of America. It was about the fact that a lot of that infrastructure is getting to the point where it needs some serious work done on it. And a suggestion that the bridge collapse like you had last year won't be the only one if somebody doesn't get serious about it.
When you look at the difference between past presidents and what their budgets had gone through, what Obama is doing is he is investing in this country. Now, granted, you're splitting hairs, you're still spending money that you don't have, and wishful thinking that there is going to be an economic return on this. But what Obama is doing, and again, this gets back to the fundamental difference between Democrats and Republicans, is that he's investing. Big government is investing in this country, whereas the Republicans would say, well, this money would be better spent if we outsource this to construction companies instead of having the government hire people to put them into these works programs. Why don't we hire huge contractors and have the private sector do it? But what happens there is that usually ends up as cronyism, no-bid contracts, where friends of friends, either Democrats or Republicans, that get these jobs are charging the U.S. government far more than it had gone through your
Well, the principle of contracting out, no one's ever cottoned on to the first principle of contracting out, and that is you actually contract out the contracting out. See, part of the problem is people end up dealing with bureaucrats who have really no concept of what they're doing. But if you contract out the contracting out, so you actually have somebody who's a tough negotiator carrying it out, then it's a lot more easy. And then you also have the other principle of disqualification, and that is that canvassing anyone for a job is automatic disqualification.
There are government agencies, government departments that are supposed to do that.
Yeah, but that's the problem.
Get into.
Bureaucrats have got no idea, Richard. They honestly have no idea. Moving right along, something else that has also turned out to be, well, it's becoming potentially a controversy here. It's called cage fighting. And I think that in the US it's called ultimate fighting. I suppose the best way we could describe it is almost like an extreme form of boxing. And there's a big debate raging here at the moment whether it's a sport that should actually be allowed and whether it should be classified as a sport in the first instance. Well, what's been the experience in the US with cage or ultimate fighting as far as you know?
When this thing first started out in the mid to late 90s, this was basically a bar fight that you sold admission to. This was a nasty, dirty sport. I use the term loosely. It had a rough start, a lot of controversy. It was just terrible. As a matter of fact, it got to the point where Senator John McCain from Arizona had seen one of these fights and then immediately went to the Senate to outlaw the sport. It didn't take off except in small circles. It's probably the equivalent of dog fighting and cockfighting. It is just a nasty thing. The industry finally got its act together and started initiating some rules and cleaning up its sport, but it's still one of these, it's very voyeuristic. It's like watching a car wreck. There may be a huge market for it, but it's very limited in its exposure here. There's only a couple of television networks that carry it. Professional wrestling, and again, which is pure entertainment, gets far more coverage than ultimate fighting, being mixed martial arts, which is Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, Muay Thai, kickboxing, and just all-in-out boxing. They wear gloves now. When it first started out, they didn't, but there's a lot of blood drawn, and I have an issue with any sport where people don't wear footwear.
Well, is that just a standard thing of yours, is it? Don't wear footwear. Anyone that doesn't wear shoes isn't doing it right.
It's disgusting. I can
You know, you've made an interesting point. I'll put something to you. You said that it's voyeuristic. I'd absolutely agree with that. But all sport is voyeuristic because a lot of sport is based around the concept of combat. I mean, I'll put it to you this way. We have not changed since the days of Colosseum when we were feeding people to the lions. The only thing is we don't actually have to feed people to the lions now. We can actually have a battle where everyone lives. But the principle remains exactly the same. And I think that what this is doing is just pushing that to the next level.
Gone are the days where boxing was as big as it used to be when we had Muhammad Ali and George Foreman and even late as Mike Tyson. But I couldn't tell you who the heavyweight champion of the world is. It's not televised. They're not big draws in Madison Square Garden.
Is that because over the years it acquired a less than ideal reputation?
I think so. I think people have lost their taste for seeing two men knocking each other senseless. That's why there's such a niche market for this ultimate fighting.
See, it's rather interesting because I suppose also some of the other main sports have taken a fair bit of the attention. And is that due to lack of interest, or is that just due to some areas having more money to throw at things? You know, because whether we look, I mean, when you look at it this way, even if we compare our two codes of football, which I know are different, but when you look at them, they're both basically combative. You know what I mean? It's okay, sure, we're civilised about how we do it. We don't have to kill anyone. I mean, sure, people draw blood and take injuries and what have you, but that's not actually the object of the exercise. But I mean, much sport is voyeuristic. It's about people combating each other in different ways. I mean, I've often thought that we haven't really changed from the days of the Colosseum. All we had to do is we don't actually have to kill people because we've got things like virtual reality, and we have other competitions where you can sort of simulate that combat without actually creating a true victim in the sense that we think about it. And I guess when you think about it, a lot of these things sort of tap into that, don't they?
The difference between both our football leagues and any sort of fighting, in fighting, people want to beat somebody into submission.
Yeah, they do.
Gets hurt, gets knocked down. In football, that's just part of the game, but you're not out there to hurt somebody.
Yeah, you're not actually, the object of the exercise isn't to do it. No, you're quite right. Hey, Richard, we're out of time, but as always, good fun. We'll have a chat next week.
All right, brother, go Dockers.